Finally, our burden is gone. Everything is ours now.
Money does not always destroy families. Sometimes it simply reveals what was already hiding inside them. Finally, Malcolm said, leaning back against the hospital wall with a smile he did not even try to hide. It's over. Darius gave a short laugh. No more midnight calls. No more chest pains. No more telling us how to run a company that should already be ours. Caleb looked toward the closed treatment doors, then lowered his voice. Do you realize what this means? Malcolm turned toward him. The hotels. The houses. The shares. Everything. Their mother, Vivian Langston, had spent more than 30 years building the life they were already dividing in their minds. She had raised the three brothers alone after their father died, worked herself exhausted to keep them secure, and eventually built Langston Heritage Hotels and Resorts into a national luxury brand. Now the three 32-year-old brothers stood outside an intensive care treatment area speaking as if the hardest part of losing their mother was waiting for control of what she owned. She was becoming a burden anyway, Darius muttered. Caleb's expression changed, but he said nothing. Then the treatment doors opened. Dr. Adrian Cole, the cardiac surgeon leading Vivian's emergency care, stepped into the hallway. Malcolm straightened. Is there paperwork we need to sign? Dr. Cole did not answer immediately. He looked at all three brothers, then stepped closer. She heard everything. The hallway went silent. Because Vivian had not only heard her son celebrating what they believed was her death. She had heard Malcolm mention something he was never supposed to know. And if Malcolm knew the succession papers had never been signed, Vivian needed to discover how he learned about them, and why that information had mattered while she was still fighting for her life. If you enjoy powerful stories where betrayal meets unforgettable justice, subscribe to Luxury Justice Stories. Now, let's continue. 30 years earlier, Vivian Langston had been a young widow with 3 small boys and bills that did not care she was grieving. Her husband's death left her with a mortgage, modest savings, and 3 children who still expected him to walk through the door. Vivian learned quickly that grief had to wait until after breakfast, school, laundry, and rent. She worked office jobs during the week, coordinated catering on weekends, and took every honest opportunity that gave her son stability. Her break came arranging lodging and events for regional companies. Vivian was good at remembering details, negotiating firmly, and keeping promises. Years later, she bought a small hotel. Then another. By the time Malcolm, Darius, and Caleb reached adulthood, Langston Heritage Hotels and Resorts had become a national luxury brand. But success never erased the fear Vivian carried from those early years. She remembered how one unexpected bill could threaten everything. So whenever her son struggled, she stepped in. She corrected Malcolm's expensive mistakes, covered Darius when projects went too far, and gave Caleb another chance whenever privilege blurred his judgment. Vivian believed she was protecting them from the insecurity she had known. She did not realize she was also teaching them that when consequences became painful enough, their mother would usually absorb the cost. The triplets were talented enough to hide that problem for years. Malcolm understood finance and corporate strategy. Darius could see potential in neglected properties. Caleb understood branding and guest experience. Vivian educated them well and eventually brought all 3 into the company. At first, watching them work beside her felt like the reward for everything she had survived. Then success began changing expectation into entitlement. Malcolm started talking about becoming chief executive as though the position had already been promised. Darius became increasingly impatient with anyone who challenged his projects. Caleb allowed company privilege and personal luxury to overlap in ways Vivian could no longer dismiss. None of them was incompetent. That made Vivian's problem harder. They could point to real achievements whenever she questioned their judgment. Malcolm had improved financing on major acquisitions. Darius had helped revive struggling properties. Caleb had led successful campaigns. But every correction from Vivian increasingly sounded to them like one thing. Their mother refusing to step aside. Then Vivian's health forced a question nobody wanted to discuss honestly. At 68, she was managing high blood pressure and coronary artery disease. Recurring chest pain had become serious enough that her cardiologist warned her to reduce stress and stop treating exhaustion as a normal part of leadership. Vivian heard the warning as a reason to plan carefully. Her sons heard a countdown. Caleb still showed genuine concern. Darius complained that decisions stalled whenever Vivian was unwell. Malcolm said less, but he began asking senior executives what would happen if their mother could no longer lead. The final warning came when Vivian discovered that all three sons had begun moving ahead without her. Darius had made preliminary commitments toward an expensive resort project before receiving full approval. Caleb had allowed promotional budgets and personal expenses to blur. Malcolm had started discussing future executive authority with senior people as though succession were already underway. None of it amounted to theft. But together it told Vivian something she could no longer ignore. Her sons were beginning to behave as though the transfer of power had already started while she was still alive. Vivian decided she would not disinherit them or punish them simply for being ambitious. Instead, she would separate ownership from control. A new succession structure would place major leadership decisions under independent oversight. No son would automatically inherit executive authority because he carried the Langston name. They could lead, but they would have to earn it. For Vivian, the decision was responsible. For Malcolm, it felt like the destruction of a future he had spent years believing belonged to him. Only a handful of people knew the restructuring documents existed. That was why Vivian became uneasy when Malcolm asked an unusually precise question. He wanted to know whether the new structure became valid when Vivian approved it, when the board accepted it, or only after she signed the final documents. Vivian looked at him. She had never told Malcolm there were documents waiting for her signature. She asked where he had heard about them. Malcolm smiled and said senior executives had been speculating. It was a reasonable answer. But it came too quickly. Vivian postponed the signing until the next morning. That evening, she called all three sons to her estate. The conversation began as business and became personal almost immediately. Vivian told them she intended to reduce automatic family authority and increase independent oversight. Malcolm called the decision an insult. Darius argued that outsiders had no right to control what their mother had built for her children. Caleb asked why Vivian had brought them into the company at all if she trusted them so little. Vivian did not hide behind authority. She admitted something they had never expected to hear. She had made mistakes too. She had given them responsibility before requiring them to prove judgment. She had protected them from too many consequences. And she had confused helping them with preparing them. Malcolm heard rejection. Darius heard judgment. Caleb heard regret. Vivian tried to explain that she was not taking away their future. She was removing the guarantee. Then pressure tightened beneath her breastbone. She stopped speaking and pressed a hand against her chest. Caleb noticed first and reached for his phone. Malcolm stopped him. Their mother had experienced chest pain before, he said. Give her a moment. Vivian tried to wave him off, but the pain sharpened and her breathing changed. Darius rushed to find her prescribed medication. Caleb hurried toward the bedroom for the folder containing her medical information. For several seconds, Malcolm was alone with Vivian. She looked directly at him and told him to call for help. Malcolm looked toward the unsigned succession folder on the table. You haven't signed it yet, have you? Vivian stared at him through the pain. She told him again to call. When Darius returned and saw how badly her condition had deteriorated, the hesitation ended. Emergency services were called. The brothers followed the ambulance to the hospital. All three appeared frightened as Vivian was rushed into emergency treatment under Dr. Adrian Cole and his team. For the first time in years, the brothers had no influence over what happened next. But Malcolm carried another realization with him. If Vivian became incapacitated before signing the restructuring, the existing governance arrangement might remain in place. Hours passed, and the information reaching the brothers came in fragments. During emergency treatment, Vivian's condition deteriorated and her heart stopped. Dr. Cole's team began resuscitation. The brothers were moved into an adjacent family consultation area while the medical staff worked behind the treatment doors. Then they heard hurried voices in the corridor. One clinician told another that they had lost her for several minutes before continuing toward the intensive care unit. Malcolm went still. Darius asked whether that meant she was dead. No doctor had said Vivian was dead. But exhaustion, fear, and assumption filled the silence where facts should have been. For several moments, nobody spoke. Then grief mixed with something Vivian would never have expected to hear from the children she had spent her life protecting. Malcolm leaned back against the wall. Finally. It's over. Darius gave a bitter laugh. No more midnight calls. No more chest pains. No more restrictions. No more waiting for Vivian to approve decisions they believed should already belong to them. Caleb looked toward the closed treatment doors. Then he asked whether they understood what this meant now. The hotels. The houses. The shares. Everything. The conversation became uglier. Darius called Vivian a burden. Caleb stopped laughing almost immediately, but he did not defend her. Then Malcolm said something careless. The succession papers had never been signed. Nothing had changed. What the brothers did not know was that Vivian had been resuscitated. During a brief period of awareness before further sedation, voices from the adjacent consultation area carried through the corridor. She could not follow every sentence. She did not need to. Her sons believed she was dead. They were talking about her life as though its most important remaining purpose was what they would receive from it. And Malcolm knew the precise status of documents Vivian had never told him existed. Dr. Cole eventually stepped into the hallway. The brothers rushed him with questions. Vivian had been resuscitated and stabilized, he explained, though her condition remained serious. Malcolm asked how conscious she had been. Darius asked what she might remember. Dr. Cole watched them carefully. During a brief period of awareness, he explained, Vivian had been able to hear voices outside the treatment area. Malcolm tried to suggest she must have been confused. Dr. Cole stepped closer. She heard everything. Malcolm's face changed first. Darius stopped speaking. Caleb sat down. The woman they had just reduced to an inheritance had heard them do it. Vivian woke weak, frightened, and deeply humiliated. Dr. Cole explained that the delay before emergency treatment might have increased the danger she faced, though medicine could not tell her exactly how much difference those minutes had made. Her memory returned in pieces. Caleb reaching for his phone. Malcolm telling him to wait. Darius leaving for medication. Being alone with Malcolm. Asking him for help. His eyes moving toward the papers. His question about whether they had been signed. And later, through the hospital wall, the voices of her sons discussing the life that would begin when hers ended. Her first instinct was the same one that had governed her motherhood for decades. Protect the family. Recover quietly. Avoid scandal. Keep Langston Heritage away from public embarrassment. Then Vivian recognized the instinct for what it was. She had spent years absorbing consequences before they reached her sons. If she buried this too, she would be doing exactly the same thing again. Only this time, the cost had nearly been her life. So Vivian made a different choice. She did not accuse Malcolm. She listened. Each son visited separately. Malcolm became careful and attentive, asking about medication, recovery, and company matters. Darius apologized for the argument at the estate without mentioning the hospital conversation. Caleb admitted that he was ashamed of what they had said, but could not bring himself to repeat all of it. Vivian asked simple questions instead. What time had emergency services been called? Who had been in the room? Who knew about the succession meeting? Had anyone recently asked what would happen if she became temporarily unable to lead? She asked for 3 things. The emergency call timeline. The access history for the confidential succession documents. And records showing who had recently asked about temporary incapacity. The answers did not reveal one dramatic conspiracy. They created a pattern. The emergency call had been placed after the point Vivian remembered asking Malcolm directly for help. A confidential restructuring draft had been accessed using credentials connected to Malcolm's strategy group. And Malcolm had privately asked how voting authority would work if Vivian became incapacitated. None of those facts proved he had caused her medical crisis. None proved he wanted her dead. And Malcolm had an explanation for every one of them. The document access was ordinary executive preparation. The questions about incapacity were responsible succession planning. The delayed emergency call was confusion during a frightening moment. Vivian hated that the explanations were possible. She had been in severe pain. She had later been heavily medicated. Memory formed under those conditions could be imperfect. She also knew what she had heard outside the intensive care unit had left her angry enough to see calculation everywhere. She refused to punish her son simply because suspicion felt convincing. Then Caleb remembered something. When he had returned with Vivian's medical folder, Malcolm had not been kneeling beside their mother. He had not been reaching for a phone. He had been standing near the table where the unsigned succession papers lay. Darius remembered something too. Several days before Vivian collapsed, Malcolm had asked whether he knew when Vivian's new structure became official. At the time, Darius had thought it was ordinary succession talk. Now the question sounded different. For the first time since Vivian's hospitalization, the triplet stopped behaving like a single offended unit. Darius had been arrogant. Caleb had been weak. Both had resented their mother. But neither had known how precisely Malcolm had been tracking the documents or why their timing mattered to him. The brothers began looking at one another differently. When Vivian was strong enough, she asked Malcolm to meet her alone. She did not accuse him of causing her heart attack. She did not ask whether he wanted her dead. She placed the emergency timeline between them and asked one question. "Why did you wait?" Malcolm immediately denied that he had. "Everything happened quickly," he said. "People freeze during emergencies." Vivian agreed. Then she asked why, during those supposedly confused moments, he had been thinking clearly enough to ask whether the succession papers had been signed. Malcolm said he had heard executives discussing the restructuring. Vivian asked why the confidential draft had been accessed through credentials connected to his strategy group. Malcolm said members of his team regularly prepared governance analysis. Vivian asked why he had already been asking about temporary incapacity. Malcolm said any responsible executive should understand what happened when a founder suddenly could not lead. Every explanation sounded possible by itself. Together, they no longer formed one believable story. Malcolm finally argued that calling several minutes earlier might not have changed Vivian's medical outcome. Vivian looked at him for a long time. That was not the question. She was not asking whether a doctor could prove those minutes changed what happened to her heart. She was asking what Malcolm had chosen while his mother was looking directly at him and asking for help. His resistance weakened. He said he had believed she would recover. Vivian waited. Malcolm looked away. If she stabilized before signing the restructuring, he admitted, there would still have been time to persuade her to reconsider. That was the truth Vivian had been trying to reach. Malcolm had not planned the heart attack. He had not created the emergency. He insisted he had never wanted his mother to die. But when she asked for help, he allowed himself to believe that waiting a little longer might preserve the future he wanted. For several crucial moments, Vivian's safety and Malcolm's ambition had occupied the same calculation. And ambition had not immediately lost. Malcolm tried to explain what becoming chief executive had come to represent. He had spent years believing that one day taking Vivian's place would prove her sacrifices after their father died had produced something worthy. When she created independent oversight, he did not hear caution. He heard a verdict on the man he had become. Vivian understood why that hurt. She did not accept what he had done because of it. For most of her life as a mother, understanding one of her sons had eventually become a reason to rescue him. This time, she separated the two. Malcolm's fear of failure could explain his choice without erasing it. His being her son could make the consequences painful without making them unnecessary. Keeping everything inside the family would have been easier. Vivian had enough money and influence to discourage questions and protect the company from embarrassment. But hiding the truth would mean doing exactly what had helped create the problem. She would be paying the cost for Malcolm again. Vivian authorized a formal review and preserved the medical timeline, emergency records, governance questions, and document access history. She did not accuse Malcolm of attempting to kill her because the evidence did not support that claim. Whether delaying the emergency call carried legal consequences would be determined by investigators, not by Vivian's anger. Inside Langston Heritage, Malcolm was suspended from executive authority. More importantly, the presumed path he had treated as his inheritance ended. If he ever returned to leadership consideration, it would be through an independent process, not because Vivian quietly restored what he had lost. Darius and Caleb were not excused simply because Malcolm's conduct was worse. Vivian ordered an independent review of Darius's unauthorized resort commitments. He lost authority to make major development deals without approval and was required to unwind promises he had made before receiving authorization. Caleb's spending was audited. Personal expenses that had been passed through promotional budgets were repaid, and he was placed under an outside executive until he could demonstrate better judgment. Vivian did not confuse justice with humiliation. Their legitimate ownership interests remained protected. Their automatic control did not. Weeks later, after Vivian had regained enough strength to work limited hours, she asked Darius and Caleb to meet her at one of the earliest hotels connected to the business she had built. Malcolm's absence carried its own weight. Vivian told them something she had never admitted so plainly. After their father died, she had been terrified they would grow up feeling deprived. Whenever she had the power to remove pain from their path, she did. "I thought I was giving you security," she told them. "Sometimes I was teaching you that somebody else would always pay." Darius had no clever answer. Caleb apologized without asking to be forgiven immediately. Vivian told them love had not disappeared. But trust was different. Trust was not inherited. It would have to be rebuilt through behavior. Vivian changed too. She did not survive the hospital only to return to Langston Heritage and seize every decision back into her own hands. An independent succession committee was established. Future leadership would depend on performance, judgment, and trust rather than family expectation. Darius remained under tighter oversight. Caleb stayed and began the slower work of rebuilding credibility. Malcolm's future remained uncertain, shaped by consequences Vivian had finally refused to erase for him. Vivian also began treating her own life as something that did not have to be sacrificed to prove she loved her children. She attended medical appointments. She reduced her workload. And she stopped believing that being a good mother required protecting her sons from every disappointment. What she had heard outside that treatment room could never be unheard. Her sons had believed she was dead, and for a few terrible minutes they had spoken about her less like their mother than like the final obstacle between them and an inheritance. Vivian could not force herself to forget that. She could decide what it meant. Their failure in that hallway did not erase the 32 years she had loved them. And her love for them did not erase what they had done. She no longer needed one truth to cancel the other. She had spent most of her life building an empire so her sons would never know insecurity. In the end, the most important inheritance she gave them was the one her money had delayed for far too long, the knowledge that love could remain even when rescue stopped, and that every choice eventually came with a cost. Do you believe Vivian made the right decision, or would you have handled it differently? Tell us in the comments. Subscribe to Luxury Justice Stories for more powerful stories of betrayal, courage, and unforgettable justice. If you think inheritance can destroy a family, watch what happened when another billionaire overheard one conversation before handing his empire to his son.